Welcome to CDC's Insight program, a series of talks that aims to share practical lessons on private sector investment and development based on experience, knowledge, and research. My name is Colin Buckley, and I will be your chair today. Today, we have a rare opportunity to appreciate the wide scope of impact investing, especially in emerging markets. 20 years ago, a handful of visionaries began to push the concept of impact investing. Among them were Ronnie Cohen of Bridges Ventures, Jacqueline Novogratz of Acumen, and Vineet Rai, who set up Aavishkaar and who joins us today. We'll spend some time with Vineet tracing the arc of impact investing's growth, but we'll also bring the conversation up to date by looking at one of the current emerging lenses of impact investing. And Jen Braswell of CDC will join us for that portion, considering how gender equality has emerged as one of the hot focuses for impact investing. Introducing Vineet presents quite a challenge. You either go the long route, which would take us almost the entire time allotted, or you resolve to only hit the highlights. I've decided to just hit the highlights, Vineet. Suffice to say that Vineet is a pioneer in impact investing. He set up Aavishkaar as an impact fund manager 20 years ago, and today, Aavishkaar employs 5,000 employees and manages over $1 billion in assets. Vineet has been consulted by politicians like Prime Minister Modi, by international organizations such as the OECD and the United Nations, and his list of honors is long, but it includes the one that I pick out, being named Impact Investor of the Year by News Corp. So welcome, Vineet.
Thank you, Colin.
So let's go back to the start, 20 years ago. And I was struck by comments you made on an Indian podcast last year, that when you started this journey, impact investing wasn't even a term. And instead, you started with an aim to solve a particular issue about poverty and internal migration in India. And I'm wondering if you could go back and sort of just tell us that story of what brought you into impact investing.
So Colin, I'm a forester, and thank you for having me and giving that lovely introduction. It was quite impressive. I myself was very impressed, though the reality may not be as impressive. I'm a forester by training, and so the fact that I'm in investing itself is a misnomer in that sense. I was in the forest. I was very happy. Then I got married. My wife didn't find forest as enchanting, so I had to leave the forest, go to a management school, and then I joined, or probably set up India's first incubator in 1997. And my job was to convert farmers' ideas into businesses. In those 4 years of trying to convert farmers' ideas into business, there were 2-3 things I learned. The first thing I learned was entrepreneurship can make a significant difference, but it is not about the idea alone. It is about really building an entire ecosystem around the idea. And capital is important, but missing, especially capital that can take risk. And it is very, very critical to attract talent that are willing to work there. Now, I was talking about rural India. And so I set myself up to search for that capital that can solve this problem of capital not seeking risk, not going to rural India, and also trying to attract talent that will go there. So that's really what my journey was. And that's how I came to it. Of course, the term impact investing did not exist. At that point of time, neither I knew Jacqueline nor I knew Ronnie Cohen. On the path over the last 20 years, of course, we have interacted significantly. But that's really the background.
And I mean, it's interesting because as we look back, there were these 3 people that all started businesses right around the same time, but each one of them took a dramatically different path in impact investing. And your path has been one of this notion of an ecosystem. And many of us know of Aavishkaar as a fund manager, but Aavishkaar is actually a group, and it has a number of other entities. But I wonder if you can talk about this, because that, in retrospect, that was a relatively radical notion that you have to think about things other than just the capital. So can you talk about this kind of ecosystem that goes beyond just financial products?
So Colin, I think, as I told you, I come from forestry. So the term ecosystem was not alien to me. It was very natural to me. I lived in a forest. So when I started looking at entrepreneurs, I realized they're very different kind of entrepreneurs. So there are some people who are forced to become an entrepreneur just for survival. You can call them survival entrepreneurs. Then there are entrepreneurs who are running small businesses. They don't want to scale, but they continue to need capital. They have all kinds of challenges, etc. And then there are entrepreneurs who are solving very large problems. And these entrepreneurs want to scale and become large. And these problems are also very large. So you can actually provide capital to them at large scale and make them become large. In the process, you will make a lot of money. And so I realized that there is a lot of different kinds of entrepreneurs and their demands are very different. At the same time, I also realized that there is no one single solution. So you require capital in different formats. You require talent in different formats. And you require technology. And this discovery about technology is actually a later phase. I actually discovered it around 2010, that a lot of problems that we were trying to solve can actually get solved if you integrate technology in it. Now, so you are actually talking about a very complex metric that is emerging. And that's what I saw in forest. You have grass, you have herbs, you have shrubs, you have trees, you have animals, you have mammals, you have birds, and everybody coexists and everybody has an interaction with it. And I also saw the same thing happening in the ecosystem. So you have micro entrepreneurs, you have middle size who are part of the supply chain of those who are scaling up. And at the same time, my interest was what business can solve real problems. And I defined at that point of time, I started with the belief that my definition of impact is, can I make poor rich? Can you make poor rich? That's how I defined it. Very naive definition. I was 29, so you have to give me some slack on it. Very big notions. As I have gained wisdom, I have tried to break this poor to rich strategy into, can you create jobs and livelihoods where people live? And I think important, where people live is very important for me. Can you actually reduce risk and vulnerabilities in the life of people where they are living, who are largely coming from the lower economic strata? And finally, what I realized, and this is actually my biggest learning, is if the problem that you are solving is of great scale, then the returns can also be significant. And all this come together as impact investing in my view.
So, I mean, if we thought about this in terms of impacts, because I want to go back to this ecosystem, and generally we think of the inputs in a very simplistic model of being, you have a business and then the capital is the input, and then you have maybe management as an input. But your ecosystem contemplates a lot more inputs going into a successful business. So, I mean, we've got capital, we've got entrepreneurial spirit. We'll come back and talk about that. But what are the other pieces? I mean, is it advisory work? I mean, some of those other inputs, you talked about technology.
So Colin, I think if you look at the group, the way the group has come through. So I realized very quickly and early that capital that can take risks, so Avishkar Capital, which is the impact investing arm, was critical. Then we built a company called Intellectual Capital. That is really what we realized is you need to actually identify entrepreneurs with bright ideas, and you have to groom them and coach them so that they can engage with investors. Remember, investors talk a very different language. And I learned very quickly that if you put a lot of investors and a lot of entrepreneurs in one room, the investors will come out saying, I couldn't find the entrepreneur, and the entrepreneur will come out saying, I didn't find the investor. So it's not really about putting them in one place. It is making them speak the language that each one can understand. So the entrepreneur is always talking about solving a problem, doing something else, while the investor is looking at, can I get my money back? How do I get liquidity? What kind of IRRs, MIC, etc. Very different languages. And we realize it is very difficult to teach the investor the language of the entrepreneur, but it is very easy to teach the entrepreneur the language of the investor. I have always believed that entrepreneurs are on a higher intellectual hierarchy than investors are. So it's easier to teach them to come down a little bit than take the investors up. And so we created Intellicap to play that role. We launched something called Sankalp, which now does a reasonably good job in Africa as well, not just in India and Indonesia as well. In addition to that, at some point of time around 2010, I launched two more initiatives. One of them was a microfinance company. Now, microfinance in 2010 had already existed in India. I was actually the first investor in a lot of microfinance companies that are very, very large today. But I think the most important thing that we did was we acquired a microfinance company in low income states in India and created a digital journey for very low end, very economically lower strata borrowers, which I thought was real financial inclusion. Instead of doing cash logistics, we actually took the whole idea of digital transformation. And then we launched a cash flow based lending platform, which uses technology extensively. So what we have done as Aavishkaar Group is we provide risk capital, we try to bring corporates, investors, entrepreneurs together through Sankalp and Intellicap. We come up with new models. For example, we helped set up India Impact Investor Council. We played an early role in setting up of Global Impact Investor Network as well. And also something called Circular Apparel Innovation Factory now in India. So these are innovative things that you do so that actually you can bring government, corporates, investors, entrepreneurs together. But more importantly, build an ecosystem so that new ideas can come and you can capitalize them and then take them up and create scale, which is all very critical if you don't do it. I think the most important thing probably we have managed to do in India is that we have blurred the boundary between mainstream investing and impact investing. And that really what explains to you the significant scale some of the enterprise that fall into the impact space have achieved in India.
I'm curious about digging a little deeper in this, the inability to communicate between entrepreneurs and let's say mainstream investors. Because I think it's very true that, these markets, our markets are now flush with capital. And yet we're still struggling to see these kind of matches being made. Some of it is language, but investors also say that entrepreneurs are generally not large enough to invest in, and entrepreneurs lack the capital to sort of cross the divide to become large enough to invest in. So, I mean, how do we bridge this gap so that we can get the capital where it's needed?
Colin, I think you have actually raised the most important challenge that everybody faces right now, and which is actually the investors have defined a risk-reward paradigm. And that risk-reward paradigm does not take into account a continuum. It has happened in the mainstream, so it's not true, it's not happened in the mainstream. The venture capital, private equity, bulge bracket investors, that has happened in an IPO. So there is actually an entire continuum that has developed, but that has been developed on the basis that the risk will deliver the kind. So venture capital funds will lose 80% of their capital, but 20% will give them maybe a 10x return or 5x return. That probability itself is quite exciting. And so capital has actually distributed. When it comes to impact investing, specifically when we are talking about entrepreneurs who are solving large, complex social problems, the time it takes for them, because you are actually trying to build an enterprise in a broken ecosystem, very different from a Silicon Valley or a Bangalore ecosystem, where capital, talent, competitive entrepreneurship, liquidity, all stand shoulder to shoulder. When I go to a low income state, there is no capital, there is no talent, there is an entrepreneur who's actually trying to solve a problem, they have challenges with the government, there's all kinds of challenges. The growth rate takes time to come through, and that requires patience. So I think it is less of a discussion about doing impact investing, do I get low returns? It is actually about doing impact investing, do you take longer time to generate returns? And as you know, IRR is a function of time. So if you are going to give a 6x return in 10 years time, your IRR surely will be lower than giving it in 3 years time. Now, somehow, unfortunately, we have not been able to still break through this conundrum that you can deliver significant returns in impact investing, but it takes just longer time. So you can get 6x, 7x, sometimes 20x also. It just takes longer time, and that would mean that IRR, which is a very time-dependent factor, may be lower, but the multiples could still be reasonable. And I think to some extent, we are proving it, but the problem that I foresee right now is there has been a migration towards what mainstream does, because every business creates impact. So it's easier for me to invest in a larger company, which is at late stage where a mainstream investor wants to invest to generate return in a shorter period of time, than to actually go and do the painful work of identifying an entrepreneur at early stage and building a company. And this conflict is not going to go away in a hurry unless you can create perfect ecosystems, which, as you know, is a very long demanding challenge, requires significant participation, both from talented people and capital providers. So this is no wrong or right. It's just that we are in the business of trying to build this ecosystem. And 20 years later, while there is a significant acceptance of impact investing, but the impact investing that has been accepted largely by the world is very close to what mainstream already does. And I think that really is our challenge. So people like me, if I define my challenge is, instead of mainstream mimicking us, impact investing mimics mainstream.
Yeah, I mean, you wrote an article about 10 years ago in The Guardian that kind of made the somewhat provocative, claim that just the terms that we use, and the one you used there was social entrepreneur, but impact investing could be another one, we're inhibiting mainstream investing taking this on, that, being a social entrepreneur might be seen as something that is not a normal investment. And you made the claim that social entrepreneurs are really nothing more than either high risk, early stage, and so forth. I'm curious, in the last 10 years, do you think that that's still a problem, that, getting mainstream investing to take this up, we're struggling with the language that we've chosen?
So, Colin, I think I actually just yesterday, Government Securities and Exchange Board of India actually approved the social stock exchange program, where I have been able to convince the government to introduce impact investing as actually a term. So they have come up with social impact funds as a category, which was not there. It was social finance earlier, and nobody wanted to actually register a social venture fund. But I think the important thing is the moment you put a word social in front of an entrepreneur, the belief among the investors was the person is not interested in generating returns. That was actually the belief in 2010, 2011, 2012. Interestingly, a lot of entrepreneurs in India didn't want to be called social entrepreneur. And the reason was that because then investors will simply shun them. Over the last 10 years in India specifically, and I'm being very particular about India, we have been able to bridge the divide between impact investors and mainstream investors. So today, if you look at Avishkar's portfolio companies and you ask who is my follow-on investor, it is the Accels, the Chirates, the Sequoias, the mainstream guys. And the reason is there is a serious belief amongst tech investors and mainstream investors that the complex social problems that are very, very large, like for example, agriculture and farmers' income, financial inclusion, waste, water, sanitation. If there is an element of innovation and technology and scale, then there is a reason for them to participate because there is a huge chance that there may be an outsized return possible, specifically if somebody who understands that space is willing to take the first risk. And I think that change has happened in India. But if I go to Africa, or if I go to Indonesia, or if I go to Bangladesh or Sri Lanka, where we also invest, there is long distance to go for that gap to be bridged.
Yeah. So before we turn and add our next guest into the conversation, I don't want to miss the opportunity to talk a little bit about the turbulent times that we find ourselves in, and really around COVID. And many of our Insight events a year ago focused on kind of what role investors should take in trying to sort of address the challenges of COVID. I think now we've got a much better view of what those challenges might be. But I'm kind of curious if you think there is a relationship, whether the build back from COVID is an opportunity or a hindrance, or really not terribly important in the longer path of impact investing. And again, we can talk in India.
So I think, Colin, I'll actually tell you, I'll take a slightly broader view here. And I actually thought that COVID has disrupted the way capital, the $300 trillion, the mainstream capital, it has actually disrupted the thought process of the $300 trillion. Nobody actually ever in their wildest dream thought that the world will come to a standstill for a fairly long period of time. I don't think so anybody thought anywhere in the world. And the conversation post-COVID has actually been far more empathetic towards global challenges that may bring the world to a standstill. And that transition has taken place in the last 12 months. In fact, the idea or the discussion around climate, the idea and discussions around more impactful business, the idea and discussions around, and this is all coming from mainstream investors, which we are engaged with, that there is a conversation that they are willing to engage in is that can you see another similar risk emanating from an unheralded area, which we don't understand and we don't know? And will that bring, so there is the fear that the discussion around climate has been long enough, there's been a lot of political discourse, but capital has always remained away from it. And my personal belief is the $300 trillion that has actually remained and only focus has been how to make more money, probably now is very concerned that there are other forces outside in the ecosystem they're playing that may actually reduce the ability or actually completely take away the ability to make money. And a significant part of that money, and I was part of Better Business, Better World report that we wrote, where we said 2.5 trillion is what the world needs on an annual basis for next 12 years for it to reach anywhere close to sustainable development goals. I think I actually am far more positive about that capital will flow in now than I was before COVID. So very simply put, I see a larger number of people in that 300 trillion mainstream economy trying to move towards some form of impact investing, not necessarily full absolute impact investing like Raviskar does or CDC does, but some form of impact investing where they will be conscious about the challenges that the world, the universe faces, and not just the risk that they face.
Well, it's great always to hear a silver lining. Before I introduce our next guest, let me just remind everyone that we are taking questions, and if you can submit them in the Q&A box, there should be a button on the bottom of all of your screens, and then we'll pick them up at the end of this discussion. So now let me introduce Jen Braswell. Jen Braswell is the Director of Value Creation Strategies at CDC, focused on market building and advisory services in CDC priority impact areas, which are gender equality, climate change, job quality, and skills and leadership. Jen's emerged as a recognized leader in the area of gender finance and has led CDC's partnership with the 2X Challenge Initiative and the DFI Gender Finance Collaborative. So welcome, Jen.
Thanks, Colin.
Yeah, let me start out. I mean, gender finance has sort of burst out as a as a hot new area of impact investing. But can you walk us through maybe the last 2 or 3 years of, you know, how much progress has been made in this very short time?
Great. Yeah, thanks, Colin. It's a pleasure to be here, and a particular pleasure to be here with you today, Vineet, particularly because you've been at the forefront of thinking about intentional investing to solve problems, deploying capital to actually address some of the challenges that we see worldwide. And that is what we've been doing in CDC and with our partners over the last 5 years, which is CDC's current 5-year strategy period, in terms of becoming and thinking about how we can deploy our capital with a more intentional lens to look at some of the key developmental challenges that our markets experience, and to think through how the businesses in our markets can result and generate impacts in those areas, and how our capital can be deployed specifically to target those challenges. And so, as you said, Colin, one of the key areas we've been focusing on is the question about participation of women and empowerment of women in the private sector. And so in order to do that, we have to develop and think and have a framework for deciding how to define the right level of participation that for us indicates that a business is so-called gender smart. So we set off on this journey about 3 years ago, as you said, Colin, with several of our DFI peers in the space of development finance, to create that framework, which has become the 2X criteria, or the 2X investing framework. And the way that we think about it at CDC, and now I think it's becoming the standard, is to look at 4 key areas where women participate. So when we define gender lens investing, it is to meaningfully consider where and how women participate in our investments in order to decide whether this is an investment that can be supportive and produce the outcomes for women that we would like to produce. So we're solving the problem of gender gaps in our markets. And so we think about 4 areas. One of them is entrepreneurship and promoting and supporting more women as entrepreneurs. There is a huge finance gap for women who are starting up and owning businesses. So that's a key area we focus on. The second area is thinking about women as leaders. So promoting and supporting businesses to bring more women into leadership and decision-making, which we believe has a trickle-down and cascading positive effect on business decision-making. The third area is looking at women as workers and bringing more women into quality jobs and workforce, which we believe has both commercial benefits and productivity benefits and benefits with retention, et cetera. So there's a core business case, but also brings more women into a position of empowerment. And then the fourth area is to support businesses and invest in businesses that meaningfully develop products and services to serve women. So these are the kind of core building blocks of our strategy. And now we're working on 2 key channels to think about how to channel and target our capital into businesses that fit these categories. One of them is originating intentionally for businesses that already are supportive of women and are gender smart. And the other area is to work with the portfolio that we have, the businesses that we already invest in. As you said, Vineet, every business has impact. And so we can work with the companies that we invest in, our partner investees, to make changes, to develop a more gender balanced leadership team, to think about how to encourage more women and support more women in workforce, and to think about designing products and services differently. So that's the journey that we're on now.
Thanks, Jen. And Vineet, I mean, we've seen this in Avishkar's work as well, and I'm kind of curious to get your thoughts about how you've seen gender lens investing kind of rise. But I did note that in your most recent annual report, you highlighted, I think, 55 million women leaders that have been impacted by your investments. So what has this meant for Avishkar and how Avishkar approaches both making investments and their own operations inside Avishkar?
I think, Colin, I actually genuinely believe that microfinance has demonstrated that women are far more responsible and responsive towards their business activities. So when they are borrowers, they actually return money, and therefore microfinance institutions do not proactively lend to men, they actually lend to women. Now, I was personally trying to say, so why do women return money? Are they better entrepreneurs? Or are they actually returning money because they have a higher purpose? When they're taking money, they feel more responsible. So I don't have an evidence to say that women are better entrepreneurs. I have not done any studies, so I can't say they are better entrepreneurs. But I can surely say that they have a higher purpose. And that's why the money comes back. And they find ways to make it happen. And if those people with a higher purpose are converted into more successful or educated, coached into leadership positions and are actually made entrepreneurs and more capital is given to them, then higher purpose, which is what you require to change the world, impact, and better skills. If that is combined together, you will of course have a better world. And that's really the simple focus. And I'll tell you why I'm saying it. My wife gave me the first $2,000 for me to start. I had only $100, so she gave me $2,000 to start IntelliCap. But she never assumed that she actually played any great role in Avishkar's formation. So if you have looked at our impact report, you would see a big photograph of her in the first page. And this is the first time in our 20-year history we have acknowledged my wife's contribution to Avishkar, simply because she said, but I didn't do anything. That was her belief. Now, I forced her to write her own story from her eyes because I could have written a different story, and asked her to see what sacrifices she made for us to reach here. And that story is what she narrated there. Now, this understatement, and I think Mamuna was telling me just before this call, that men will apply for a job if they think 15% they are capable or qualify for it. And women apply only when they think they're 90% capable or qualify for it. Now, we are actually only trying to bring the discrepancy out without knowing that statistic by using the way, and we therefore have seen Avishkar has massively benefited internally by having women actually being in leadership position. But at the same time, in our investee companies, you look at microfinance, we have massively benefited in terms of returns because millions of these women have allowed us to generate returns. So overall, from a very smart perspective, we are looking to play a more proactive role in having women in strong leadership positions, because just by sheer higher purpose that they bring to the table, they may actually help us create more successful and impactful enterprises.
It's a great story about your wife, and I've heard the story about 15 and 90. Sometimes I've heard it's 5 and 110. But how do you, as a manager, actively try and attract more women into the PE industry in India?
So I think, Colin, the interesting part is Aavishkaar took an approach that we are not looking at a private equity person to join us. So if you look at Aavishkaar's entire team, most of the people have come from different backgrounds. And I actually did try to see how private equity hires. And I looked at them that they actually hire from consultants or investment bankers. That's how all the talent has been built like that. So I said, if I have to actually hire people who are not really from private equity, because our salaries, our ability to pay, etc., was very different, I would look and hire a person who is able to bring strong empathy and strong detailing skills to the table. And the more I met, and intuitively, I was not looking for women employees. I found women employees were actually far higher on empathy and far more disciplined and more skilled in terms of skills, and were more willing to take the risk of coming at the salaries that we were offering. So there are three things. Two things where we found them superior, and one thing where we were weak, they were willing to make the compromise, which probably tells you that in the first 10 years, we got a lot of people to come in at a junior position. And then some of them, by sheer dint of capability, have risen to become partners or chief of financial officers within the Aavishkaar Group. So if you look around the key designations within Aavishkaar Group, you will see women holding very strong positions as directors within the group, different positions. But then you have CFOs, CEOs, partners, also all women. And they have not come just because I was paying them less salary. They were competing against male colleagues and external people who were applying for those jobs. And by sheer dint of capability, they have reached there.
Great, Vineet. And Jen, I'm kind of curious, what the role is for an investor like CDC. How can an investor support the attraction of more women into the PE industry?
So we've actually been working to, I think, model a little bit after the Aavishkaar Group in terms of thinking about building a broader ecosystem. And we have been working with organizations like the Boardroom Africa, like PE Win in India, who themselves are focusing on collating the talent pool and bringing more women into the conversation around what the opportunity set looks like in the market. So that when we come in as an investor and we're having conversations with our fund managers about the gender balance within their teams, about what they can do to help support their portfolio to become more gender smart, we can point to these ecosystem players who are able to help find the talent, are able to help provide the resources and toolkits, the advisory services and support that's needed to be able to make some of the business changes that are required in order to bring more women into the business.
And Jen, when you talk about investors, you run into investors who are thinking about kind of gender lens investing, but aren't doing it already, or impact investors who are intrigued by, gender investing. I mean, what are the types of questions that you most frequently hear from them? I mean, what are their concerns about getting into this type of impact investing?
So I think if we're talking about the sort of positively interested group, and I say there's two groups, there's the positively interested and there's the skeptically interested. The positively interested group really want to know how to get started and what the kind of definitions are, what does it mean, so that they can begin to sort of set out their own strategies in terms of whether they would like to focus more on women entrepreneurs, or whether they want to focus more on a sort of specific strategy around businesses that serve women through their products and services. And then we often hear the kind of question around, okay, so how do we make this happen? What are the actual tools that we need and resources that are out there to help us? And that goes back to what I just mentioned in terms of those resources out in the market that are growing and that we have been helping to seed and to bring life to. I think on the skeptical side, it's been a question of, where are the women? We don't think that women are in our sector, for example, if we're talking about infrastructure or if we're talking about a particular area of the economy where women aren't traditionally active. The answer is somewhat the same, which is to point to those ecosystem players who do have access to that talent pool and who can bring in the advisory support to be able to help the businesses that we're talking with to become more, to have access to that sort of set of resources. And similarly, investors who are thinking about investing with this lens are questioning where those resources are as well. And so CDC has actually developed something called our Gender Toolkit, which is available online, and a wide range of information and resources are there, which is where I point investors to when they're asking the questions.
Thanks. And Vineet, I mean, gender lens investing is one of an increasing variety of these specialist impact themes. And the first two were probably, climate and ESG investing. But now we've got health equality, we have gender investing, and many more. I'm curious, your view of what the role is of these kind of emerging specialist themes, whether they strengthen the impact investing argument or do they confuse the market? What are your thoughts about this?
You're absolutely right, Colin. Impact investing is a horizontal. It's not a vertical, it's a horizontal. And there will be specialized vertical that will emerge. For example, climate is a very specialized vertical, but within the climate, there are specialized vertical as well. So you can go to climate tech, or you can go to natural resource-based, biomass-based sequestration. Now, you can't do actually climate tech and biomass-based sequestration investing together. They're completely different. One requires 20 years, one probably requires 7-8 years, one is very high risk, one is actually a natural process. So I think impact investing in some sense is essentially offering or giving people a choice to actually merge or mimic, in some sense, it mimics the mainstream investing. You can actually see the horizontal of impact investing, and you can see the horizontal of mainstream investing. And as I keep saying, our job is to convince the mainstream to become us instead of us to become mainstream. And that is, and I've said it many times. I was speaking at an economist conference, and I said, we don't want to be the tail that is very wagged by the dog, which is the mainstream. We want to be the tail and the dog. And so impact investing right now is the tail of the big mainstream dog, but we want the dog to also become impact. So we don't want impact investing to change. We want mainstream to change. And that's why mainstreaming impact investing sometimes sounds as if there is something wrong with impact investing and it has to become like mainstream. I'm actually saying whatever challenge is there is with the mainstream, and they have to become impact investing, or they have to use the impact investing thought process to do mainstream impact investing. And that's really where the entire discussion is going. Of course, the confusion will remain because these are all new terms and jargons do confuse. So the more jargons we throw, the more people will be confused. But at the same time, it brings in a lot of discourse, discussion, and every discussion and discourse and every point of view basically probably convinces some leader somewhere to participate in it. I can tell you, I was there when we formed Global Impact Investing Conference, Investing Network. There were only 5 people in the room, and the 5 of us started it. And then today, it is actually the place to go for impact investing. So I think I have seen what is possible in 10 years' time. And so therefore, next 10 years are going to be really path-breaking in that sense.
And Jen, sort of the same question to you. And I want to point out that, I mean, we focused on gender lens investing, but as I said in the introduction, you have teams that work on 4 priority impact areas. So, I mean, what's the benefit of having these kind of deep dives in specialist impact areas for impact investors?
Well, I think, as Vineet said, he started with a simple proposition. I want to make the poor become rich. That was the problem that you were starting with. And as impact investing has evolved over the last 20 years, I think we've all been able to build the understanding that unless we apply specific lenses to our investment capital and try to solve the specific challenges that we see out there, we won't be able to go as far or deliver the level and the scale of outcomes that we'd like to see. And so that's why we have been thinking much more deeply over the last 5 years, I would say, about how to apply a kind of rigorous framework to think about the outcomes that we want to see. And I think the benefit of doing this with applying specific lenses, if let's say a climate finance lens, or looking specifically at investing with the goal to improve the quality of workforce, is that we can understand the difference that our capital makes over time, and we can learn from that. And therefore, we can refine the way that we invest, the mechanisms by which we make our investment decisions, and importantly, the way that we interact with and support our portfolio businesses post-investment to make changes and to ensure that they are making the decisions that will produce the outcomes and the solutions to the problems that we're trying to collectively solve.
All right, thanks a lot, Jen. Okay, let's move and take some questions from the audience. The first one I'll pose to you, Vineet. So you'd mentioned that many of the businesses that you invest in ultimately look for a follow-on investment from a mainstream investor like Sequoia. So what are the arguments that you have heard for why Sequoia should should kind of provide value for the non-financial impacts that a business might have? And have you seen that willingness to kind of consider non-financial impacts change over the last 20 years?
So, Colin, very critical and important is to understand what is the impact investing proposition. The proposition is that we found an entrepreneur who's solving a very large, complex social problem. And that large social problem can be solved through a business innovation. The business innovation is very, very important. Now, the business innovation requires capital because it's a very large problem. So you need to build a large company. Let's assume for a minute, and I'll give you examples. Microfinance is an old cliched example. So I'll ignore microfinance for a bit, controversial one, but I'll ignore it still. And let's look at agriculture in India. Now, I started investing in agriculture as long back as 2008. And there was no Sequoia, no Accel, no Chirasa. Nobody wanted to invest in. But at some point of time, they started looking for what are the big areas where disruption could create significant opportunity. And agriculture seemed to be an area which has not grown. It has been struggling. There are huge opportunities for disruption, and technology will play a role. And that's where I'll say, when talent, technology come together to solve a very large, complex social problem, mainstream investors, specifically in countries like India, are extremely excited to participate in it. And they are participating because the problem is being solved. And that problem solution, in our view, because we are the one early stage investors and we are working on it, we are putting together the entire framework of how to make sure that the various people who are participating in that, specifically those who are impacted, do not get impacted by the scale. So that's really the protection that you need to do. And the business model actually is the biggest protection. No investor wants to tweak a successful business model. That's what we have learned. So the late stage investor, they are only coming after validating and establishing that this model is actually working and it is delivering the returns that they are seeking. Once they are fine with the entrepreneur's ability, the institution's ability to do that, we have not seen too many interventions that have come in except strengthening certain areas. For example, Sequoia will come in, they will actually bring in a specialized thought process around technology. And that's very welcome because it's always important for somebody who's specialized in something to add value. And therefore, our consistent belief is that when you bring in the mainstream investors, they bring specialized thought process, specialized knowledge of access to very different kind of capital that we don't have. And it therefore becomes a very good partnership. Again, in the board, there is a chemistry issue, and impact investors therefore continue to need to play a role of balancing the impact versus scale versus boom or bust. So sometimes investors come in and say you have to grow at 500%, and it doesn't matter if you die. Now, those kinds of conversations, we have to play a very important role.
Okay, thank you. Next question for you, Jen. If gender is largely a cultural and social problem in developing geographies, is there a risk that we lose the nuances around gender by adopting one standard framework of gender investing?
Yeah, that's interesting. That's actually one of the other sort of skeptical questions that investors often come with, which is to say, look, we're only providers of capital. We're investing on our risk return spectrum. And this question about women's participation, this is all very social. This is all very much a cultural construct, and we don't have a role to play in that. I think the answer is a complex one, but if capital isn't part of the solution, if capital isn't moving and supporting businesses to create the opportunities to change business as usual in order to make the workplace more conducive for women's participation, et cetera, then the social change that is needed to help women move from being focused at home to moving into the workplace will be much, much slower. So there is a role for investors to play in moving the dial in terms of the kind of social constructs that and sort of cultural constructs that might sort of impede the movement of women into the private sector. One of the things I would want to mention as well is that the more that the mainstream of investors, as we were just discussing, come into this conversation, the more comfortable everyone is in having it. And the more that this conversation is comfortable within the private sector, the more that bleeds out into the conversations that happen in communities and the conversations that are happening around the dinner table. And so there is a role for the private sector to play. And we are seeing that mainstream investors are coming into the conversation now, just in the last, I'd say, year and a half in a really meaningful way. So you mentioned that we are leading on the 2X initiative. So we've just launched the 2X Collaborative, which is an industry body that is the one-stop shop for gender lens investing. And many mainstream investors, large fund managers, pension funds, and banks are joining as members into the 2X Collaborative. So we are seeing this interest and this movement coming in. And I think that the complement of the conversation from capital providers and the conversation that trickles down into communities will help to solve this problem of inequity and lack of participation and frankly, the gaps in finance that we see for women.
Thanks, Jen. Vineet, we've spoken quite a bit about businesses trying to encourage mainstream investors to become more impact investors. But we have a question here about, is there a role for impact investors to encourage mainstream businesses to become more social or impactful businesses?
I think to be very fair to the questioner, I have actually been doing a lot of discussions with a lot of very large businesses in last 2 years. And as I told you, the COVID has brought in a change in the way they are looking at the future. I have never had those kind of conversations before. And interestingly, a lot of them, and some of them have actually decided to participate in our new fund, which, as Jen told me, she approved to be a 2X flagship for Asia, one of the first one in Asia. So just want to thank Jen and CDC and Obvium to help us do that. But I think what is happening is those conversations are coming. So we are being reached out by very large institutions who are actually global institutions who are in conversation to understand what is it that impact investing is doing. They are also coming from a certain background. So they, for example, they're in agriculture or they're in financial services, and trying to see if impact investing will bring them new insights to make them both responsible as well as productive towards communities that finally is either their customers or consumer or provider of what they are actually buying.
Okay. And another question asks, if impact investing is beginning to mimic mainstream investing, and if, as you said, all investments have an impact, do we not end up in a problem of greenwashing and impact washing where everything becomes an impact investment? And how do we guard against that?
So Colin, I think I'm a purist. I come from a very different background. I don't want to oppose people. The fact of the matter is the definition of impact investing is about intentionality, which can actually be kind by attaching suffix called impact behind your name. So XYZ impact is intentionality, because then you will disclose it in your PPM. And then if you can produce an impact report which could actually be $50,000, $100,000. So the cost of being an impact investor is quite low. And or what we call the moat. So the moat for somebody to jump from mainstream investing to impact investing is very low. And while it is a risk, but I also believe that the world, so I'm trying to now take a more wiser approach. When I was 29-year-old, I would have actually been a revolutionary and I would have opposed this. But today I'm actually not very opposing of it. I think this is actually just the start of the massive change. And some of us will have to continue to argue. And at some point of time, there will be questions that will be raised to those people who converted from mainstream to impact, hoping that the bar is very low. So you have to keep raising the bar. And as the bar goes up, you would actually see that a large number of mainstream people will become impact investors. But keeping the bar low, letting them come in and then increasing the bar probably is a very smart way of doing it. And I'm learning that smartness.
All right, thanks, Vineet. And Jen, a separate question picked up this theme and asked, are you beginning to see gender washing?
Yeah, sometimes known as pink washing. So yes, I think that in all areas of intentional impact investing, particularly as those lines continue to get blurred between the impact investing sector and the more mainstream investing sector, there is the need to ensure that there is assurance and verification and certification at the extreme that the sort of tagging of investments or investment products as having certain impacts is supported and is proven to result in the impacts or the outcomes that we're hoping to see. And so I think that's what we will start to see more in the market is assurance mechanisms and certification mechanisms so that, for example, when we talk about a 2X investment, that there is some independent verification that business is meaningfully supporting women. And on that note, let me just pause to recognize and celebrate Avishkar India Fund 6, which has been recognized and verified as a 2X flagship fund based on the work that they're doing, both to ensure gender parity within the investment team themselves so that there are women making the investment decisions alongside male counterparts, and to look at the role that women play and the meaningful and material support that their portfolio businesses have. So congratulations to Vineet and Avishkar.
And I think we all share in that congratulations. Well done, Vineet. So last question to you, Vineet. We spoke about the last 20 years and your role in kind of creating impact investing from a moment where you didn't even know the term described what you were doing. Can you take out your crystal ball and can you forecast what you think the next 20 years mean for impact investing?
I think I've learned the hard way, Colin, difficult to predict 20 years, actually difficult to predict next year after COVID. But let me try to make that decadal explain, because decades are actually very important in the life of what happens in any kind of specialist activity. So let's think about impact investing and let's look at 2030. 2030 is a very seminal year in the history of mankind. It's the first time in our human history that the leadership of 193 countries of the world has signed something called Sustainable Development Goals, where they claim that they will completely change the way the world looks. So no hunger, no poverty, no inequity by 2030. Now, to achieve that goal, as I was saying, we worked on this report called Better Business, Better World. We require, at that point of time, there was no COVID. We required $30 trillion. The total global grant pool is 300 billion, 400 billion a year. So we are 90% short, just a small amount of number. And I think, therefore, there is a huge opportunity, and this is, I'm actually using your forum to make an appeal to the world, that there is a great opportunity for the big guys, those guys who are sitting in the mainstream, for you to deliver a world that we have never imagined. I don't think so since the time Homo sapiens started walking straight, you have ever seen a world without hunger, without poverty, without inequity. We have 10 years, a resolution that 193 governments of the world have signed. We have a role to play in that. And I think if impact investing can put all its power behind this idea, every leader on impact investing, and therefore holds themselves personally accountable. Forget about the washing. There will be some people who will be doing washing, but others who can actually genuinely believe, question yourself, can you change? You have the power to change the world in next 10 years. And just hold yourself accountable. Don't go by somebody else coming and certifying. Just hold yourself accountable. I think the world will change by 2030.
Well, that's a wonderful summation. Thank you very much, Vineet. Let me try and pull some of this together. Because we've heard a very broad-ranging discussion today. But I think the themes that came out of these, first of all, is the importance of the entrepreneur, which is a theme that we've heard in previous Insight events, that it's not the idea, it's the ability to take an idea and turn it into a business. And a discussion about what is the role to assist that transformation of idea into business, business into impact. And we've all talked about capital, impact investing. But there was a very rich discussion here about this notion of ecosystem, that it's more than just capital, more than just entrepreneurial appetite. And it's interesting to think about gender lens investing is falling in that kind of part of that ecosystem, which is a supportive ecosystem is not just capital, but a big part of that may be issues like gender. And gender has a unique ability to contribute not only to the impact, it is almost an impact in its own self, but it also contributes to the better effectiveness and operation and management of a business, and potentially even to the financial return itself. So we spoke about, the importance of gender in a sense on both sides of the balance sheet. And then finally, I think we had a kind of a rich conversation about how these more specialized approaches to impact investing can support the depth of impact and this narrative that is becoming more important as we talk with mainstream investors. So a wonderfully rich conversation today. I'd like everyone to sort of join with me in a virtual round of applause. I'm afraid that's all that we can offer you in these times. And then to tell our audience that we will have another Insight event before the end of October. And I look forward to chairing that one and seeing you all at that one. So thank you very much, Vineet. Thank you very much, Jen. And thank you to our audience today. Have a good day.
Colin, namaskar.
Thank you.
Thank you, Colin. Thank you, Vineet.